Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing about the theory of absolute and comparative advantage. And I've noticed students find this topic particularly very confusing for paper 2 and for paper 1 MCQs as well. So make sure that you watch the video till the end. Now guys, we all know that international trade is basically when goods and services are exchanged between countries, and there are various gains that are made from international trade. We've already studied that before, we already know that. But the thing is that how would countries know that which good they should sort of produce and specialize into and which good they should trade? Because the concept of absolute and comparative advantage is based on the simple economic concept that instead of being self-sufficient in producing everything and ultimately end up producing both the goods in small quantities, why not specialize in the production of those goods in which you have an advantage, right? And specialize in that and then produce it in higher quantities and then trade and exchange and export it with other countries that don't sort of have an advantage, and then import those goods which you cannot produce yourself, which you don't have an advantage in producing. And this way trade could be mutually beneficial for both countries, right? So the thing is that which goods should a country produce for export and which goods should it import? And guys, the answer to this question basically lies in the concept of comparative advantage. Now guys, remember one thing very clearly, that although we're going to be studying absolute advantage in this video, but remember that the theory of comparative advantage always holds more power over absolute advantage, and how we're going to be seeing that in the later videos on this chapter as well. So one thing is very clear, that countries, instead of being self-sufficient in both the goods, they will try and specialize in which they have an advantage. Now there are two sort of advantages in this sense, and these two advantages were given by two different economists, where they sort of showed that there are two sort of advantages, and specializing based on both these advantages will ultimately result into gains from trade for both the countries, and how both the countries would be better off after specialization rather than not specializing at all and producing both the goods, right? So we're going to be studying absolute advantage first. Now, so guys, what is absolute advantage? Now, a country is said to have an absolute advantage in the production of a good when one country can produce a good with less resources than the other country. So if I can produce, let's say, good A using less resources than any other country, then I have an absolute advantage in producing good A. While the other country, let's say, can produce good B using less resources, then the other country is said to have an absolute advantage in the production of good B, right? Now, another way of putting it is that when one country can produce a good in greater quantity for the same cost. Now, it's also the same thing that we studied in the upper point, in the first bullet. So we can also put it this way as well, that another way of putting it is that one country can basically produce a good in greater quantities or larger quantities for the same cost. So incurring the same cost as the other country, but both the countries are incurring the same cost, but one country is definitely able to produce more goods, more of that particular good basically, as compared to the other country. So if one country can produce a greater quantity for the same cost compared to the other country, one way of putting it is in this way, or the same quantity, or both the countries are producing the same quantities. Let's say country A is producing 8 units of a good and country B is also producing 8 units of a good, but country A is producing 8 units of a good using less resources or at a lower cost, basically at a lower cost of production, at a lower average cost of production, then that country is said to have an absolute advantage in that particular good, which it can produce using lesser resources or at a lower cost of production. Basically, you guys need to understand that what is absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is when one country can produce a good with less resources. So definitely, which simply means that you are producing a good using lesser resources, so your average cost of production is lower. Or you could say that you could produce a higher quantity for the same cost, and you could also say that either one country could produce the same quantity at a lower cost, right? Now the concept of absolute advantage, guys, was developed, remember this, it was developed by Adam Smith, and he showed that how countries usually gain from trade by specializing in producing those goods in which it has an absolute advantage, and then exporting those goods in which they have an absolute advantage. That is, if one country can produce a good more efficiently, because obviously if you're producing the same quantity at a lower cost, you're more efficient. And if you're producing the good with less resources, it again is a sign of efficiency, because your average cost would be lower, right? So he said that specialize in producing those goods in which you have an absolute advantage that you can produce efficiently, and then exporting it basically through international trade and the concept of exchange in terms of exchanging it with another good that you cannot produce. In fact, you don't have an absolute advantage in producing that, and then trading and exchanging it with another country. So guys, Adam Smith basically argued, and I want you all to pay very close attention to this, that specializing in the good that each country has an absolute advantage in, number one, and then trading the product with the other country in which it does not have an absolute advantage is, in fact, the other country has an absolute advantage in that product, can make both the countries better off, which means that there would be gains from trade. So the post-trade position would be better than the pre-trade position, and we'll see an example in the next video as well. How does this work? How is the post-trade position better than the pre-trade position, as long as each country has an absolute advantage in one good over the other country? Okay guys, now we're going to be looking at a mathematical numerical example. So I have two countries, Australia and China, right? And I have two goods, that is kilos of lamp and meters of cloth, right? Now basically, as far as lamp is concerned, we can see that Australia can produce 6 kilos of lamp and China can only produce 4 kilos of lamp, right? And while on the other hand, if you look at cloth, then Australia can produce only 1 meter of cloth while China can produce successfully 3 meters of cloth. Now, if I were to see which country has an absolute advantage in what product, then I need to see that which country can produce a greater quantity at the same cost. We are assuming that the cost is the same, right? Now we can see that Australia has an absolute advantage in the production of lamp because Australia can produce 6 kilos of lamp while China can only produce 4 kilos of lamp, right? Well, on the other hand, China has an absolute advantage in the production of cloth because China can produce 3 meters of cloth while Australia can only produce 1 meter of cloth. So China definitely can produce more cloth than Australia using the same cost, right? So guys, we can see that right now the total world production for lamp, assuming these two countries, is 10 kilos of lamp, while total world output for cloth is 4 meters. Now we are assuming that it's only produced by these two countries because right now we're taking these two countries into our example. So guys, you need to understand that when one country has an absolute advantage in one product or one good and the other country has an absolute advantage in the other good, then it's basically said to have a reciprocal absolute advantage. So reciprocal absolute advantage exists when each country has an absolute advantage in one product, right? It could also be possible that one country has an absolute advantage in both the products. We're also going to be seeing that example in this video where one country has an absolute advantage in both the products. But if one country has an absolute advantage in one of the products, then it's said to have a reciprocal absolute advantage. So guys, after specialization, what we see is that after specialization, Australia is now producing 12 lamp while it's producing 0 cloth because if it's invested all its resources into the production of lamp. It's basically doubled its resources in producing lamp. So if you double your resources in producing lamp, then definitely all your resources have moved into, because you're specializing in it, right? So if you're doubling your resources in producing lamp, that makes Australia produce 12 lamps before it was only able to produce 6 lamps. So it doubles its production. Now over here we are assuming constant returns to scale, which simply means that if you double your inputs, your output doubles as well. And on the other hand, China is, so obviously 0 cloth will now be made because Australia is only specializing in the production of lamp now, while China is specializing in the production of cloth. So before it could make 3 units of cloth, now it is going to make 6 units of cloth. It will double its production as well, because China has doubled its resources to the production of cloth since it's specializing in it, right? So the output of cloth goes to 6, right? Now we can clearly see that the world output has gone up because now what's happening is that 12 lamps are being made. 12 lamps are being made, while on the other hand, 6 cloth is now being made. Initially, what was the world output? The world output was 10 lamps while 4 cloths. Now you can see that the world output is 12 lamps, which means the world output for lamp goes up from 10. From 10, the world output for lamp goes up to 12, right? It increases by 2. On the other hand, the world output for cloth also goes up from 4 to 6. It also increases by 2. So this is definitely a gain, right? This is a gain in terms of world output, right? And it was only possible because of specialization in which you have an absolute advantage in, right? So that's one thing. That is what exactly Adam Smith said, to specialize in which you have an absolute advantage in, right? Now, right now I haven't really shown that how countries will gain once they trade, because right now I've just shown how the world output goes up, but I haven't really shown how would both countries like Australia and China gain by trading with each other. This is not shown right now. This will be shown in the next video by another example. But one thing before I end this video, I need you guys to know is that it's not that a country could said to have an absolute advantage only in one product. One country could have an absolute advantage in both the products, and then in that case, what will be the basis of trade? In that case, the basis of trade will be comparative advantage. Now, for example, you can see here that as far as wine is concerned, France can produce more wine, that is 3 units of wine, while as far as cheese is concerned, France can produce more cheese. So France can basically produce more wine and it can produce more cheese as compared to Poland, which means that France has an absolute advantage in the production of both the goods because it can produce a greater quantity for wine and for cheese using the same cost as compared to Poland. So now what could happen? Now basically it means that France shouldn't trade with Poland. Should France produce both the goods? Should France basically produce wine as well and cheese as well and satisfy its domestic production and consumption, and it should not indulge in any sort of trade? Now, in this case, what happened is that in the 19th century, famous economist David Ricardo, he was the first economist to mathematically proved that trade could still be beneficial to both the countries, not only to France, but to Poland as well. Although Poland does not have an absolute advantage in either wine or cheese, and France has an absolute advantage in both wine and cheese. But mathematically, David Ricardo proved that despite the fact that France has an absolute advantage in wine and cheese, still it should not produce both. And despite the fact that Poland does not have an absolute advantage in either of the goods, still it should produce either one of the goods, right? So either one of the goods should be produced by France, either one of the goods should be produced, and one of the goods should be produced by Poland, and then they should mutually trade with each other. And mathematically prove that France will gain as well, and as well as Poland will gain as well. And his theory was that despite the fact that France has an absolute advantage in both the goods, France only has a comparative advantage in one of the goods. And he gave the theory of comparative advantage, and he said that countries can still trade and gain based on the concept of comparative advantage, which means that a country would have a comparative advantage if it can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. But that's not the purpose of this video. We're going to be seeing it in the following videos. So that's it for this video, guys. I hope you understood the concept of absolute advantage. Now in the next video, that is the coming video, we're going to see a numerical example where both the countries would specialize based on absolute advantage, and then they would trade with each other based on a suitable exchange ratio. And then we're going to see how do we calculate those exchange ratio, and then we're going to see how would both the countries benefit after trade, and how would they mutually gain, and how is it that theory of Adam Smith based on absolute advantage mutually beneficial for both the countries. Okay guys, see you guys in that video. Until then, take care.